as you know, the Stanford campus, I mean, I'm sure it's much less tense than other campuses, but we have by the bookstore these tents of pro-Palestine occupiers, and then right across the sidewalk, this big Jewish tent, and there are police officers there all the time.
Yes. And we had a Stanford professor who was a mentor of Colin Kaepernick, who I shouldn't say professor, he was a lecturer. And he asked the Jewish students to go to one side of the room and leave their backpacks on the other so they would experience what he said was apartheid. I just say that because one of the mythologies of these protest groups is that they're not anti-Semitic, they're only anti-Israeli. But every time there's an incident like this, the professor, or the lecturer, I should say, again, the instructor at Stanford didn't say, well, I'm going to make an example of pro-Israeli people. So anybody who supports Israel, he just assumed any Jewish people could be collectively attacked. And when the Jewish students were in the Cooper Union Library, nobody of the pro-Hamas demonstrators said, we want to know who is for Israel and who is not. Or when they were hitting a piñata yelling, beat the effing what? They didn't say beat the effing Israeli. They said beat the effing Jew. So what I'm getting at is after October 7th, there was no more pretense that it wasn't anti-Semitic. In the past, the pro-Hamas or pro-Palestinian movement said it's not against Jews, it's only against pro-Zionists. And now, I guess, nobody takes much effort to disguise the fact they don't like Jews. And that's borne out statistically when the FBI director said that 2.4% of the population is now suffering 60% of all hate crimes, and that there's been a 500% increase in that incidence of attacks on Jews. So when I see these protests and I talk to people, because those protest areas on the Stanford campus are right between my apartment and the Hoover Institution. So every day I walk by, you encounter, you see their sloganeering written in chalk, as you've probably seen on the sidewalk. You see people there. You even see signs that say, be quiet, don't disturb the protesters, they're asleep in the tents. So, I mean, it's very in your face. And the faculty is and the students are very afraid, because I've stopped at both sides and talk to them. But I would say that there is not a fear of the Arab students or the supporters of Hamas, or whatever term they particularly, there's not a fear that they are a singled out minority that might be subject to overt discrimination. There's a sense that they are the voice of the faculty and the students, and they have majority support. Whereas you talk to the Jewish group, they feel, for whatever reason, I think justified, that they are targeted. And that is new. That hasn't happened before in my 70 years in this country.
Yeah, well, maybe it's a totally stupid thing for me to do to have this interview. I mean, talking to you, I've been told by professors that I won't ever get a job for even if I'm being neutral, which I am, or interviewing Marxists or pro-Palestinians, just having a conversation like this. You're just not allowed to espouse or even entertain non-dominant views if you're in academia.
No, you can't. If it is any solace to you, that never ceases. So I've been at the Hoover Institution for 20 years. We have, for senior fellows, de facto tenure. But during the anger at the Trump administration, I was singled out for appearing on Fox News. And so I had to go before the Stanford Faculty Senate, along with Neil Ferguson and Scott Atlas. I don't think anybody today, once this hysteria has worn off, believes that Scott Atlas's skepticism about the viability and the utility of mass quarantines was mistaken. They probably feel he's pressing it now, even though they tried to destroy him. I don't think anybody feels that the distinguished historian Neil Ferguson is culpable of anything from a private email where he sort of jokingly said you have to use Oppo research, that canceled out. I don't think anybody would even mention that today. I don't think given the number of Stanford faculty that go on to MSNBC or CNN, that the fact that I was on Fox after the election of 2020 was any big deal today. So I think a person just has to say what they have, and they have to say it in a way that's polite and respectful for people who disagree with them, and they have to go on. I know that when I was in your situation at Stanford, ironically, in the classics PhD program in 1975 to 79, I was told, the chairman, who's now deceased, called us all in and he said, "You're 4 white males in your class. Only, I think, 2 of us finished the degree. 3 of us finished the degree." He said, "There is 0 chance that you're going to get a job under the new affirmative action guidelines because women haven't been hired, and now we're admitting women. And you're probably going to be the last class of white males. So we want you to sign this and tell us that we're not legally culpable, advising that we suggested you would get a job. None of you are going to get a job." And not only one did after 3 years. So in my case, it was a double whammy because my thesis advisor said that I was also very conservative and rural. I think he used the word rustic. And he warned people about me. He said that I wasn't a typical academic. I didn't speak modern languages very well. I just read them, which I thought I passed all my exams in them. But the point I'm making is that I went out, it's pretty humiliating to have a PhD in classics and you cannot be hired as a high school teacher in your hometown because you don't have a credential. And I couldn't get a job, so I farmed for 5 years. But my attitude was always, you have to go with your strengths. So if you got a good education, what are your strengths? And you would try to develop and try to write, try to speak. And at some point, even if you're farming in the middle of nowhere, people will be aware that you're sincere, you're disinterested, you're trying to achieve a little excellent, and it'll all work out in the end, and you'll feel better than if you had changed your views or adopted to the situation. And I know that whether it was at UC Santa Cruz, I didn't participate in the rioting of the 1970s and the campus turmoil. All my professors were leftists, and yet I felt if I knew Greek and Latin better than the competition, they would at least have some adherence to disinterested evaluations, and they did. And the same thing was true at Stanford and at Cal State Fresno. I don't think out of 1,000 persons on the faculty, there was more than 10 conservatives. And when I wrote Mexifornia, I remember going on campus and the Voice of Aztlan had a picture with a crosshair, like a sniper's lens with my face on it. And I went to the president at that time. I said, "Look, this is not just hate speech." And he just said, "You wrote Mexifornia. What do you expect?" And so in academia, you just accept these parameters, I think. And it's not going to change given the nature of academia, structural in nature.
I've been told essentially the same thing by many faculty about never getting a job for some of the reasons that you just mentioned. So I don't know if I'll be farming, but I will.
There's always places that
Yeah,
I do think it's changing. So there are places, Hillsdale College, St. Thomas Aquinas, the new University of Austin, Ralston College. There's starting to be alternative areas that they don't want just conservatives, but they're willing to hire people who are traditionalists or not part of the academic establishment. I think it's going to grow, especially after October 7th and the testimony of the Ivy League presidents. I think and I think the mood of the country is now that there's something wrong with academia. If you have the 3 most illustrious Ivy League, all women, one a person of color, there's no stodgy white males up there. But if you have 3 enlightened people, according to the protocols of academia and the values of academia, and they cannot say in front of the nation that it's against their code of behavior to call for the destruction of the Jewish people and the genocide of Jewish people and destruction of Israel, then something's wrong. And I think there's going to be a lot of calls, not just from conservatives, but from worried liberals, that something has to be done to diversify academia and get different modes of thought and return it to, and we had the Supreme Court ruling about affirmative action. I think the idea that these atolls can practice certain codes that are antithetical to the Constitution, a racially separated graduation or a racially separated dorm, and think that by calling it a theme house or optional or any of these things, it excuses them. I think those days are over. I really do. I think people are now saying, you know what, you can't just create your own world on a campus, not when you have tax-free endowment income, not when you get millions of dollars in federal grants, not when you rely on a $2 trillion student loan subsidy industry, you know. So I think it's changing.